Hello, folks. Welcome back to World War II TV. And I have not read much yet, but already Second Front by my guest Marc Milner looks to be a real game changer in terms of how we assess and understand the dynamics of the Overlord planning and especially the relationship between the Allies in Normandy. So that's the book. The links to it are in the description below. Pre-order right now. I've got a copy because I got it from the publisher, but I'll bring Marc in now. Good afternoon, Marc. How are you today?
I'm great, Paul. Thank you. I've never seen the book yet, so that's a
Oh, well, I've got one and you haven't. Oh, well, one
yeah
up on you. So there's a
pleasure to be.
lot to dig into here because the Normandy campaign is mostly, well, we know it's probably the campaign we've written about the most. We think we've got to grips with the relationships and the power plays, things like that, and yet you're kind of reversing things and suggesting things weren't quite as good as they were. But before we get into that, where did this special relationship between the US and the Britain kind of originate? Because you take your book takes us back to the First World War.
Well, I've not made a special effort to track that down. I kind of believe, like John Charmley, that the Second World War was a special relationship, but maybe not as good as Churchill alleged after the war. And I think that's the origins of this notion of a special relationship. It's when Britain and the United States gets together after the war, and the Americans finally commit to doing something about Europe, and we're at the other end of that story now about securing Europe and keeping the Russians at bay and rebuilding Europe. And I think the trials and tribulations, if you like, of the Second World War fairly quickly get forgotten in what becomes a very close and fruitful relationship between not just Britain and the United States, but Europe and the United States. So I think the myth is a post-war fabrication, but that's my current best guess.
I mean, they're sort of like the myth of everything German being brilliant, which someone I forget who it was who reminded me of that British historian that that was part of the NATO thinking that we now have to promote the smaller, better vehicles being better than the mass numbered things, because now that's the nature of the Cold War is that we are now outnumbered by the West are outnumbered by the East. So we're playing up this idea that the German independent Tiger tank and that kind of ideology is the way forward, which changed our thinking about the war and the qualities of the various participants. But that's another conversation. We did that with Panzers in Normandy. But the press, I mean, one of the things that you talk about a lot in the book is the press influence in this. And I've long since believed that a lot of the Monty and Patton nonsense was the press making a story out of that. So we have the recollections of the key players. Churchill, of course, wrote millions of words about his career. Eisenhower
Yes.
talked about himself. But the press, how did their angle at the time influence how we think about things now?
Well, that's in some ways what the whole book is about, right? Particularly book three when you get into the Normandy campaign. Um, Listen, this is a very public war. It's a we tend to think of the internet where you can find out what's going on around the world in a matter of minutes as a new innovation. But World War II was fought with an international media, shortwave broadcasts from Germany and the United States and Britain and many other countries. There's a vast disinformation campaign going on with the information that's circulating. Newspapers from combatant countries readily available. The Germans used to take Time magazine. The embassy in Brazil would actually do a précis and wire it to Berlin or send it by the ether. Newspapers apparently were exchanged on the tarmac and in Lisbon with Axis airplanes and British airplanes parked back to back, so you could take the Continental papers off and chuck them in the British plane, and the British papers off and chuck them in the German plane. So it was quite an extensive international ongoing discourse in the public media about what's going on. So there's lots of scope for disinformation. There's lots of scope for seeing what the other side thinks is going on. I mean, the Guardian in particular was particularly good at recording what German shortwave was saying, but even what the German press was saying. So that's the first thing. The second thing is, and Patton understood this. Monty's I think, less forthcoming than Patton was, but both of them realized that they were leading democracies. They were taking democracies to war, and there needed to be a bit of circus involved in this. I don't mean silliness. I mean belief in the potential for success on the battlefield and ultimately success in the war. So, when Montgomery goes on his great parade in early 44 to all the British factories, and he gets in the media, and it's a vast PR campaign. And Patton's the same kind of guy. Patton's a little bit cruder, I think might be the right word, in his use of the press and his willingness to make headlines at the expense of his troops, particularly in Sicily. But they both realize that they're prima donnas. They're both successful in their own way, but they both realize that in order to fire their armies and fire their nations, they have to be maybe bigger than life. And that's all part of the process of democracies and press and selling the war. Because for democracies, wars have to be crusades, right? It's not enough just to say, well, we're going to attack this other country, although you wonder about the situation today, because it pleases me today because I want a piece of it. It's got to be about something bigger than that. So the press is always there. And the final point I would make, and we can come back to this, is they actually create press guidance so that the press knows how to spin the story coming out of whatever it happens to be today. There's actual guidance where you can read it, and it'll tell you that this week, this is what the president decided, and this is how you're going to spin it. And woe betide any journalist who got too far away from the track during the course of the war. So the Brits did this, the Americans did this, and eventually in Normandy, they began to issue press guidance so they could stop the press from whining about lack of good food and the French being maybe a little too sympathetic to the Germans at times. So the press is a big part of it, and in the case of the United States, there's a continuous feedback loop between what's going on in the American open media, what the Germans are picking up, and what they're broadcasting back to the United States in their shortwave broadcasts. And the Germans conduct a very effective public relations campaign and propaganda campaign in the United States throughout the whole course of the Second World War.
Brilliant start then. And I think my next question is going to be, over the last year on the channel, we looked a lot at the planning for Salerno and Anzio and the Brittany campaign, and realized by comparison, Overlord has a ridiculous amount of planning, possibly too much planning. So, we now know that 1944 is the year of the Second Front, and that your book is called Second Front, and that's where everything starts changing. But the relationship between the Americans, the Brits, the Canadians goes back to Husky, it goes back to Torch, it goes back to the earlier era. One of the things you in your notes you sent me is that the British, to some extent, were they reluctant to go forward with Overlord, or were they? But, because Churchill obviously has this obsession with the Mediterranean and Italy and the soft underbelly. So we now have this, we envisage this sort of fairly linear path from everybody agreeing there's going to be a second front to it happening in Normandy. But you're suggesting it isn't quite so straightforward.
No, I don't think it's quite so linear. The need to get back into France and to push Germany over was always understood. The big question becomes, at what point in the campaign is that going to happen, and who's going to do it? When the Americans come in, all they want to do is just get everybody together and land on the beach and go for hell to Berlin. That's kind of the way revolutionary armies work. It's the way the Americans were thinking this thing through. The British approach arguably is a little more pragmatic. It's a case of, what can we do now? What can we do in 42? Geez, we're not going to land on the coast of France. They haven't even got enough lift in landing craft. So, and this comes out of Roosevelt's push as well. Everyone thinks of North Africa as someplace the Americans were dragged into kicking and screaming, and that may be true of Marshall. But Roosevelt ordered the U.S. Army 3 times to plan an invasion of French North Africa. And it's only the 3rd time that it actually came off. And he told Eisenhower, I want it to happen before the midterm elections. You need to do this by the end of October. And eventually Eisenhower has to go to him and say, sorry, we're going to be a week late, and we missed the midterms. And Roosevelt doesn't do too badly, but he's not as comfortable in Congress as he would like to be. And so it would have been better if Torch had been, a week or 10 days earlier. Would have been even better still for. Understood. The Americans want nothing to do with the Balkans, nothing to do with the eastern basin of the Mediterranean. So by the summer, by August of 43, when they're trying to get everybody to commit to a landing in Normandy in the spring of 42, there is a chance, and historians haven't argued much about this, but I've made the case, for what it's worth in the book. There is a chance that if you can actually tip the Italian army over to your side, you can occupy the Balkans. It'll keep the Russians out, and you can start a second front against the Germans. And this, by the way, is where was the tipping point in 1918 when the breakout from Salonika took place and Serbia fell and the advance into Austria began. There were no German forces there, and the Austrians weren't going to do it. And Churchill, if you read his World in Crisis volumes from the 1920s, says this is where the war tips and the Germans then capitulate. But it all hinges on getting, and I've seen various figures, 65 or 80 Italian field divisions. That's a lot of troops. That's a lot of field division. You can argue about how efficient the Italian army is, but that's a windfall which is not easily dismissed. And part of the problem is that the Americans insist on giving the negotiations with the Badoglio government over to generals. The Brits want diplomats to conduct this because Badoglio's going nowhere until he gets some promises. And so the capitulation of Italy is handled really badly in September. And there's a period through there, September and October, where it may have been possible to have a Balkan strategy. And there is some German literature that suggests that this is one of the great missed opportunities of the war, that there really wasn't much in the Balkans. If the Italians had changed sides, the Balkans could have been occupied fairly easily by the Allies, and I say easily because we didn't actually do it. It's hard to say exactly how that would have shaken out. Would have kept the Russians out. And listen, by the way, it would have opened the Dardanelles and the Black Sea to helping the Russians, which from the British perspective would have meant you didn't have to run the Arctic convoys. The savings in resources alone from the British perspective, I think need to be explored by somebody. It's not going to be me, but there's a big savings there. So there is that missed opportunity. And well, that's going on. The planning for Overlord is taking place. And what's interesting about the Overlord planning is the Brits aren't sure that it's going to happen, not because they're not prepared to go, but they're wondering where the hell the U.S. Army is. Because in September of 43, there's only, and I'm stretching my mind here, I think there's only 3 or 4 combat divisions, U.S. combat divisions in England, and they're not ready. There's a Corps headquarters, but there's no Army headquarters. There's no Army group headquarters, much to the dismay of people trying to run the Fortitude deception operation, because you just need that stuff to build on. And the Americans actually do arrive perilously late in Britain, right through to December of 43. The Brits are all going, this is going to happen in the spring. Where the hell is the American army that's supposed to do this? So, Britain has an enormous commitment. They're bringing troops back from Italy. They bring back 30 Corps and some divisions. And there's not a lot left for Britain to commit. There's about 9 or maybe a dozen divisions in the UK once they get them all assembled that they can put in the field. What they're waiting for are the American divisions, and the Americans are doing just about everything the last minute. And I think one of the chapters, or somewhere on one of the things I said in one of those chapters was, if D-Day is going to happen in the spring of 44, where are the Americans? So they come tumbling in, about 1 million of them in the winter of 44, and they're not ready to fight. The Marshall's still taking 2,000-3,000 men out of formed divisions and piling them into divisions that are going overseas. And you can read it all about this in the book. The divisions that are coming to the UK are supposed to be combat ready and trained to fight. And what they get are units that have been put together on the wharf in New York in their final form, bringing up the companies to strength and all that stuff, and then brought to the UK, and somehow they have to train them, and there isn't time to do that. And of course, we can talk about this ad nauseum, but Eisenhower's not alone in trying to get the Air Force involved, because both the U.S. Army Air Force and the Royal Air Force insist in the fall of 43 that Overlord won't be necessary. We're going to bomb the crap out of Germany, and they're going to capitulate. And right into the spring, right into May of 44, Spaatz is still basically saying that. 8th Air Force and 15th Air Force are still trying to win the war. He's afraid that Harris will do it before he does, but Harris gets a bloody nose in the Battle of Berlin, and by April is pretty well committed to the transportation plan. And the U.S. Navy, when they expand the operation and go from a 3-division landing to a 5-division landing, Ernie King says, not my problem. Overlord is a British naval problem. You guys sort it out. So there's a huge gunfight goes on with the U.S. Navy in February and March over trying not just to get landing craft, but to actually get headquarters ships for the assaults, to get gunfire support, to get minesweepers, so that in the end, the Americans send more than they had originally promised. But the American commitment to the naval side of Overlord, which is Neptune, is actually still pretty small, all things considered. You know, that the minesweepers off Omaha Beach are Canadian. The Canadians are the first to arrive there. They're about a mile off of Omaha.
Well, you're good at being the first to arrive. I mean, when you were saying about the American divisions arriving in the UK, I was thinking of, Canadian divisions, some units there in 1940, along with the Poles and others. And
December of 39.
Yeah. So, it's you have a habit of getting there first. And
some guys have been there almost 5 years. And if you read what they say, their interviews, it's like the only way home is through France, and I want to go home. Let's get this done, get it over with. So anyway, the Brits are. Well, you have to read the book, but I don't think the Brits are as uncommitted to Overlord. Brooke is not uncommitted to Overlord. Churchill is anxious. Sure, why not? There's not a lot of people left in the British Army. You can't have a first day of the Somme on D-Day. Anyway, sorry, I prattled on.
No, that's a very good point, and I like the fact you mentioned the Balkans, because every time I meet with a kind of a conclave of historians, I keep saying, why hasn't anybody done a kind of a definitive 2020s book about the Balkans? They all go, it's too complicated, too many languages, too many archives, too many travel trips, too many things. And I think because the American army arrived in Europe in 19, for the First World War, primarily fought in and through France. I think that obviously that steers the American thinking that the gateway to World War II is obviously France to Germany. And then the Brits have got maybe more of a Mediterranean view of things because of empire, because of Suez Canal and things like that. But once the Allies are on all together behind Overlord, and it gradually trundles along towards we know its outcome, what problems were there for the relationship during this time? Because I've always felt that Torch was the worst period of the American-British relationship myself. I think that was the low point. But what were the potholes in the road once they've decided on France?
Allocating who's going to go ashore, where, and how many. You may know, and I've written before, that the original Cossack plan had the Canadians, actually Second British Army as the assault formation, and First Canadian Army as the breakout formation. And then when the Americans come in, the assault formation becomes First U.S. Army with the Canadians as the breakout formation. And then the problem becomes, well, that's really not enough. We can't put Brits in third place. And so the whole argument about who goes where and who does what is resolved fairly quickly in early January. At one point, Montgomery wants the British forces to land on that nice stretch of beach between the Orne and the Veer, and the Americans can go land in Brittany, right? Because they're going to have to capture the ports anyway, so they might as well just start in Brittany and go off over there, and that's not going to happen. The Americans actually get control, if that's the right term, for the Overlord operation in the fall, when it becomes led by First U.S. Army, and they actually change over all the staff arrangements and the planning arrangements at Cossack headquarters, so they reflect continental staff practices and American practices and all that kind of stuff. So when Montgomery comes back to the UK at the end of December 1943, the current Cossack plan, which everybody agrees, even Freddie Morgan agrees, is way too small. It's just tiny compared to what they need. The question then becomes, how do you shoehorn the British and the Americans into a joint landing which gives enough profile for both? And the 5-division assault that Montgomery comes up with is a very clever and really quite excellent solution to that. It allows 2nd British Army and 1st U.S. Army to land side by side. The Americans in some ways are not happy with that, because if it had just been 1st U.S. Army leading a 3-division assault, then command of Overlord on the ground would have been Bradley's. But when you get 2 armies and Bradley's in command of 1, and Montgomery comes back and they say, well, we'll put Monty in command of the ground forces and put Dempsey in command of the 2nd British Army. So the British actually get control, if that's the right term, of the landing operations. And they already have control of the air operations, and they get control of naval operations. So the Americans, particularly American press, is not very happy with the idea that Eisenhower is kind of chairman of the board, but all the effective command and control is done by British officers in 3 elements. And so the American press often has to fudge this by suggesting that Admiral Ramsay is the senior British naval officer, and Admiral Kincaid is, I think it's Kincaid, is the senior American officer, and they're roughly equivalent, which is just not true. That Bradley and Montgomery are in command of their contingents, and they're roughly equivalent, which is just not true. It's not true at all. So the issue of British in command of American troops, and Montgomery does this with a very light hand. He's not a hands-on guy in terms of Bradley. That kind of tension exists throughout the whole Normandy campaign, and it blows up in August of 1944 when Bradley gets pushed up to be 12th Army Group commander. And Montgomery takes over 21st Army Group, but retains operational command of ground forces in the theater. So he's double-headed, right? And that creates enormous tension and hardship in the American press over the fact that we cannot get out from under these friggin' Brits, and we need to. And the ultimate result of that is the split of Allied armies east of Paris. The Brits go northeast, the Americans go east, because the American press and what little I can find in the scuttlebutt in Washington, is that now that the campaign's settled and the Americans are getting ashore in numbers, we can't be under British command. None of us. So when Montgomery wants maybe 20 American divisions to help him with the thrust northeast towards Antwerp and get across the Rhine at Arnhem and get into the North German plain, Eisenhower has to be very circumspect about what he does, because the American press is down on him like a ton of bricks for leaving these guys under perfidious Albion's command. So the politics of command, and that's there in any number of books, right? There's a whole literature about broad front, narrow front, and about the politics of it, and about what happens at the Battle of the Bulge when they really do reach a low point, when it looks like they're fighting each other more than they're fighting the Germans. And I don't want to, we shouldn't make too much of this. Maybe my book does that, I don't know. At the grassroots level, at the operational level, at the army level, and probably at the corps level, and even troops on the ground, that these formations and troops function seamlessly. They get along well. There's at one point the 104th Timberwolf Division is switched to 1st Canadian Army Command and fights there for about 6 weeks. And the Canadians actually reinforce them with some heavy anti-tank units, and it all performs marvelously well by this stage of the war at that level. The acrimony at the upper level is partly over who gets the kudos right at the end. Who wins? And there's no question. I think the final chapter of my book is an American victory. The Americans win. The Brits do a huge amount of the fighting, but the Americans win. And when you look back, then it becomes a story of how do we get to the point where the Americans are all over Germany and the Anglo-Canadian armies are stuck in a little corner up in the north. So that kind of argument over influence, over who controls Europe, they're fighting over whether there should be constitutional monarchies or not. The Americans are not happy with what happens in Rome, not happy with the British support of the Greek monarchy. The Brits are trying to keep the communists at bay, and that's one of the themes that might well be explored a little bit more by somebody else. But I said in the book, and I think it's true, the Americans are fighting to win the war. The British are fighting to win the peace. And you will find a number of occasions where the British are criticized by the Americans for fighting for political purposes, by which they mean, who's going to be on the throne, who's going to run the government in Austria, all that kind of stuff. And yes, they are, because it matters. The Americans are so steeped in their own domestic politics that they don't see the influence of those politics on the conduct of their operations and the conduct of their army. Don't forget, 1944 is a presidential election year.
Yeah.
Roosevelt has to win. He has to deliver the victory. Somebody said, what you don't want to read about next spring is Churchill, Stalin, and Dewey celebrate the end of the war. So Roosevelt's got to stay for the fourth term, which changes the American Constitution ultimately. So by 44, the Americans cannot be seen to be in behind the Brits. They have to be the lead horse. And increasingly they are. There's no question in terms of resources and the troops they pour ashore. They got 60 divisions in the field by the spring of 45. It's about the size of the BEF in 1918. It's a big army. The Brits are nowhere near that. There aren't enough people.
I want to bring the Canadians in now, because if people haven't noticed, you are Canadian, and it's so often we Brits sometimes lump you in with the Americans. Americans, if they mention you at all, lump you in with the Brits, and it's complicated, because as the British are clearly becoming the junior partner in the relationship between the Brits and Americans, where do the Canadians fit in? Because they're playing this important role in the Northwest European campaign, the Great Swan, and other campaigns like that. They're battling away in Italy, and yet there are, of course, the Canadian historians telling the Canadian story for a largely Canadian audience, David O'Keefe and Mark Zelkin, all those guys there. But in the big discussions, where does Canada fit? Has someone like yourself, who's been studying for a long time, have you kind of worked out where the Canadian story fits in, and if so, where?
Well, in some ways, Second Front is an attempt to do that. I spent much of my life as a naval historian working on the Battle of the Atlantic. I worked on some of the RCAF official history. I've always been interested in the Normandy campaign. Anybody who suffers their way through the introduction will know that. So I've always been interested in where Canada fits. Canada was a comparative industrial giant, which is flummoxes almost everybody who writes about the Second World War. I was going through the papers of Robert Brand in the Bodleian Library one day as part of this project, and he's a banker, an international banker, and he had a kind of list of countries in order of production, and it was on a kind of big spreadsheet. I should have taken a picture of it. Anyway, there was Britain, the United States, and Russia right at the top. And then you drop down some distance, and then there was Canada in a kind of section all to itself. And then at the bottom of the page, it was like everybody else: Brazil, Australia, Mexico. Pick a country. So Canada is the fourth largest allied producer, but it's not insignificant. And the tragedy for us is that there was an official history of what was then called the Department of Munitions and Supply, produced, I think, about 1947. By a guy named Kennedy, 2-volume history, pretty perfunctory. It's good, but it's pretty, there's a volume on kind of narrative of what happened, and then there's a volume on, a chapter on guns and a chapter on steel and all that kind of stuff. And then apparently once that was produced in the late 40s, they took all the documents to a landfill site. Gone. Completely. Disappeared. No one can find them. People have been looking in the Canadian archives and in warehouses for decades. So it appears that all the records of Canada's great industrial miracle in the Second World War disappear. As early as the fall of 41, our GDP is bigger than Italy's. We've got 11 million people, right? So we produce what in the end is arguably the third or fifth largest Allied Navy, the fifth largest Allied Air Force, a good, compact, very powerful little army of 6 divisions, which we can sustain in the field, and an industrial capacity which is seconded only in from the British perspective by the Americans. And the Americans dwarf us in the end, but up to the summer of 43, if you believe what some of Churchill's advisors told him, Canada was producing more war supplies for Britain than the United States, plus food, right, grain, all that kind of stuff. So Canada is enormously important. So there's the industrial side, which doesn't get much of a look in. But there's two or three things that I think really matter. One is, and I got maybe prejudice again about this because I've cut my teeth on the Battle of the Atlantic, but it's the Canadian Navy's growth in 41, 42, and 43 that essentially allows the Americans to abandon the Atlantic and fight the Pacific War. Everyone says, well, Canada, the Navy's big and it helped the British. Yeah, but the operational command, the actual tasking of responsibilities in the Northwest Atlantic from the mid-ocean back is American by international agreement. And we just gradually fill that slot. We end up producing a Navy of about 400 operational vessels, which is not bad. Doesn't compare to 1,200 in the Brits and 3,600 in the Americans, but it's pretty good sized little flotilla. And we make it possible for the Americans to actually deploy virtually all their weight, and the British do as well, into the Pacific. And if you read, what's his name? It'll come to me anyway. His book on industrialization and mobilization in the Second World War. O'Brien?
Phillips O'Brien, yeah.
Phillips O'Brien, yeah. The U.S. Navy's, the whole idea of a Germany first strategy does not exist in the U.S. Navy. They're just Pacific first, all the way. All the steel goes to build ships and fight. And that would not have been possible if they'd had to actually fight in the Atlantic on a scale that was required. So in the end, Canada ends up running convoys north of New York. The Americans, by the way, do run their military convoys. There's a series of convoys called the CU-UC convoys. They are part of Operation Bolero, which is the military buildup in the UK. They run those convoys. We run the mercantile convoys. And in 1944, we take complete control over those. And if you think it's actually unimportant, when the issue of control over the Georges Bank fishery, which lies off of New England, came up in the 1980s, and Canada claimed a residual and legacy fishery on what was called the tail of the bank, or the northeast part of the Georges Bank, which is a good oyster and lobster fishery place, and among other things. The International Court awarded that northern third of the Georges Bank, if you draw a line down through the Gulf of Maine, to Canada on the basis of the fact that it had been the dominant naval power in the region in the 20th century. Right, so it had some ramifications. The Air Force is tougher to peg, but Canada becomes the airborne of the airdrome of democracy. We end up building about 100 and some odd flight schools. We produce over 200,000 air crew, and at its peak, about, if you believe the Canadian figures, and maybe I do, but no one's challenged them, about 1 in 4 air crew in the RAF is Canadian, and 1 in 4 squadrons in the RAF is Canadian. And in the Battle of the Atlantic, it's as high as a third. And when you check everybody else together, but the Canadians in particular, the Royal Air Force would not have been an Air Force on the scale that it was without the ability to recruit Canadian personnel and build squadrons. And here's the other kicker. 83 Group RAF supports Second British Army in the Normandy campaign, built and paid for by the RCAF and by Canada, because it was supposed to support 1st Canadian Army. So over half the squadrons in 83 Group are Canadian. A lot of the maintenance, repair, runway, hospital staff, headquarters for wings and what would they have? Sections or divisions? Canadian. And there would have been more if 1st Canadian Army hadn't gotten the boot in December. And I think they backed off on Canadianizing it afterwards. But the British Army goes ashore with a predominantly Canadian tactical air force in support. So, there's any number of reasons. And as I've argued in the book, the Canadian Army is small, but it plays a critically important role, not least of which in that somewhat curious and occasionally derided role as the dagger pointed at Berlin, McNaughton's dagger, because it plays a key role in the deception operation over a landing in the West from 42 right through to 44, actually right through to August of 44, McNaughton's dagger. So in the day when it was believed that Germany would collapse in a heat, there'd be revolution and SOE would light Europe on fire, the army that went ashore would be small, heavily mechanized formation, which would be led by 1st Canadian Army. And the Germans seem to have believed that. There are transcripts of their international wireless broadcasts in Colonel Ralston's papers. Ralston was the Canadian Minister of National Defense in 43, 44. And he was fed transcripts of German broadcasts, and the Germans actually believed the Canadians were coming, and the Germans said as much on the 8th of June as part of the deception operation. Specially trained Canadian forces are about to land in the Pas-de-Calais. Well, it's a pretty important role. So
which is going to bring us to Patton as well, isn't it, in a minute? Because the deception thing, I mean, I'm sorry to interrupt you mid-flow there.
No, that's all right. I talk all day about this.
In a couple of, in my lifetime, kind of the two big factors I think that came into Overlord discussion. One was Ultra and code breaking, and there were the books written without really that knowledge back in the day. Then it was that all the information was out, and you had to mention Ultra and the deception. I think that the Fortitude North, Fortitude South wasn't talked about in some of the early books, and then was talked about. And I'm kind of in the camp that we almost talk about it too much now. I'm kind of fed up with that bloody photo of those four guys holding up that inflatable Sherman. Because I think we kind of overplay that a bit. But again, your book does talk about this, because in planning the real invasion, they obviously are discussing operational security of the whole thing, and therefore the deception campaign.
Yep.
What's your assessment of where the deception fits in? I mean, you've just talked about the Canadian dagger there, but in popular mythology and where we should be in understanding the campaign.
Well, I think this is the bottom line. Until early August of 1944, virtually every German division that gets to Normandy comes from somewhere other than the Pas-de-Calais. And in fact, German 15th Army increases in size. In June, it's got 15 divisions, 19 divisions, sorry. And by early July, it's up to 21. The divisions that are coming to Normandy are coming from everywhere else. They're coming from Germany. They're coming from southern France. They're coming from Belgium. They're coming from Holland. They're not coming from the Pas-de-Calais. So the deception works. I don't think the Allies would have lost if 15th Army had suddenly just got on the road and marched south. It would have been a hell of a battle. I don't think we would have lost that. But the fact that they didn't turn up meant that we had more than enough to do with what was actually there. So yeah, it's important. And if you believe, there's little snippets. And one of the problems with this project is I spent 20 years, I guess, looking for the snippets. So maybe I made a whole book out of small pieces. But Ralph Ingersoll, who was a noted American publisher, who ended up in the Army in 1944, because I guess if you had enough clout, you could become a colonel and do stuff, watched the British Fortitude operation in the spring of 1944. And he was just gobsmacked. From his perspective, the Brits were devious bastards. They were so slippery. And I sometimes think, I didn't put it in the book, but I sometimes think one of the reasons why the Americans don't trust the British so much is not because of what the British do to the Americans. It's because of what they see the British doing to the Germans. Right. So if they're actually screwing the Germans around like this, what are we getting out of this? And it pops up again in early July. There's a little entry in Chester Hansen's diary. Chester Hansen was Bradley's military assistant, executive assistant, and major. And Eisenhower comes by because he's come over to see what's happened with Epsom and Panther tanks and all that stuff. And they have a little briefing. They're drinking a little bit of Calvados in the evening. And Hansen writes in his diary that Eisenhower said that the British are so far ahead of us in intelligence and deception. We don't even begin to understand how far ahead they are in this stuff. Because at that point, they're in the process of basically relaunching Fortitude, because they've realized the Germans are still actually taking the bait. They still think that there's going to be a landing, and they think there's going to be a landing. And this ties in, into the book. They think there's going to be a landing probably around the 17th, 18th, 19th of July, because that's when the moon and tide phases are right for an assault on the Pas-de-Calais. So the push is on again in early July to kind of recalibrate and relaunch the Fortitude operation. And I found echoes of it, and I put it in the book in the British press. How they're supporting the deception operation by speculating on what comes next. So I think the deception operation is really profoundly important. It does keep anything up to 20 divisions off the back of what's already a pretty embattled force in Normandy. And like I said, I don't think the Allies would have been driven into the sea, but the campaign would have lasted in Normandy quite a bit longer if those divisions had come south, assuming they could be supported.
No, good point. We talked before going live about some of the archives you discovered, because let's say someone does decide to do a book about the Balkans. There would be obviously some primary sources there that haven't been discovered.
Yes.
But obviously with Normandy, there's a shitload that's been written, and there's a shitload of archives everywhere. Over the 80 years people have been writing about it. Do you feel that people have been going, in a sense, to the top of the pile of documents again and again and again, and looking at the same correspondence, the same diaries, the same notes, which is sort of why we're telling the same story? Because you have uncovered different archives and different correspondence that has steered your thinking. So perhaps you want to share it. I mean, you mentioned that before we going live, a couple of examples. So where you've got your conclusions from. What haven't historians been looking for?
Well, I did mention to you that I think the documentation has been very heavily weeded. And I don't mean necessarily redacted. Redacted is when you scratch stuff out. This is material that's just got chucked.
Yeah.
For example, there are. I know the Brits are frustrated. You read Brooke's diary, and he's exasperated with Harry Crerar, and he's exasperated with McNaughton. And then you go to what survives in the archives, and it's almost nothing there. So, it's a typical thing that historians face. A huge amount of what transpires in history takes place over a mug of beer, right? And what gets in the paper trail, or what gets into people's diaries, is just an inkling of it. The most obvious case that I came across in terms of the process of restricting critical assessments of each other of anybody actually in the literature is that incident where there's mentioned the correspondence between Dill in Washington and Brooke in London, and there's a file in the Liddell Hart archives in the King's College, and please don't throw it out, in which there are 19 letters from Dill to Brooke in the fall of 43, and the disposal recommendation on the inside of the folder, which lists all the correspondence, the dates, the name, the subject of the correspondence. There's a recommendation: retain or destroy. 18 of the 19 letters were recommended for destruction, and they're all still there. And there's some good bits in there. There's some candid stuff that just doesn't turn up in more, if you like, public sources. So that is an issue, and as an historian, it's always frustrating because it's tantalizing. I know this guy. I know he's thinking about that. And then when you find it, you realize that your instinct's probably good. I come back to the kind of essence of your question. I think there's two things going on. I think you're right. I think there's a tendency to operate off the top of the pile. So you go to the standard Overlord sources, you go to the War Diary of 21st Army Group, you go to Montgomery's papers, you write it up, and then you get a regimental history somewhere, and you build Private Bloggin's account of what it was like to be in Goodwood, and you put it in, and it makes another good book, and it adds to the compendium, if you like, of published material. I think that process is evident in the literature. Someone said history doesn't repeat itself, but historians do. So the other thing that's happening, particularly with Normandy, but I've seen it, I've been in this business now for 50 years, and I ran seminars for grad students for more than 30 years, and we talked about this continuously. There is a tendency in the publishing industry just to actually to say, what's happening next year? Paul, do you know if anybody's doing a book on, pick the date? If next year is the 75th, or 2 years out is the 75th anniversary of pick an event, do we have an author? Do we have a title that we can actually put on the shelves for the 60th anniversary of D-Day, or the 75th anniversary of D-Day, or Dunkirk again? So you find an agent, and he casts around and it says, the so-and-so publisher was really looking for a book on Third Eep because the anniversary's coming up. What do you got? So there is that process of the market driven, if you like, standard works that are not very inspired, if that's not being unkind. And and writers pull some stuff. There's some very fine writers who've actually become very fine historians that I know of, and they've done a lot of primary research and dug stuff out that I could never have found. But the subject that I've wrestled with for the last 25 years is a vast one. It's just friggin' ginormous, right? At one point, I was telling my colleagues, I said, "How you doing?" It's kind of like, "Oh, geez, how am I doing?" Well, I've got a short primer on Keynesian economics and a brief history of American anti-tank guns on order from Amazon in the same order, right? So talk about trying to bring threads together to tell a story that's fully integrated with the socio-economic, political, dynamic history of the war that then reflects what's happening on the ground. By the time I was done, I'd written 500,000 words, and Yale wanted 250,000. So there's a lot of stuff on the cutting room floor. But there's also, if you look at, I'm a little bit more familiar, I guess, with what's happened with naval archives, because I worked in it for most of 30 years. The British National Archives only saved a certain percentage of deck logs for ships, destroyers, and below. So if you're looking for the log of HMS, whatever it is, maybe in that 10%, chances are it's not. In the Canadian case, when they did their kind of triage after the war, they kept all the operational records for all the bases where ships were based for operational purposes. And they trashed all the training records, all the training establishments, all the stuff where you might like to see, how did they do in 41? Was the training up to snuff? Why are we seeing problems at sea? The kind of things that, this generation of historians might like to wrestle with. They just said no one's ever going to be interested in training. They just chucked it all out. And in fairness, if the world's going to be buried in paper if we save everything. So it creates a problem for historians. There is a weeding process that takes place in all archives, perhaps more vigorous in the UK, where you've got a 30-year rule. So somebody's got to see these papers and go through it. In the Canadian case, one of the things that happened since the introduction of access to information, which is supposed to make it easier to see stuff, is they've gone through files and removed anything that reflects at all on personnel, on individuals. So the few training records that I saw years ago still had some of the contemporary assessments. Lieutenant Commander so-and-so is really not very good at whatever it is he's not very good at, and we don't recommend him for promotion or for a command. Right? You're not supposed to see that stuff anymore. Back in the day, didn't matter all that much, and you use your discretion as an historian not to slag anybody or cut up their career. So the documentation is problematic. It's taken me a long time to find this story. I don't think I've abused my privilege as an historian in the process. It's fairly deeply buried in that sense. And it's not in the more overt documents. I mean, one of the things that's not there, for example, is if you go through the records of 21st Army Group, there's almost no reference to the Canadians fighting Panzer divisions from 6th of June to about 12th or 13th. They don't know where 12th SS is. The Canadians, for whatever reason, aren't telling them. And that whole story of the Canadian battle to stop the Panzers just gets missed in the contemporary documents. And since Stacey and others, we can talk about the problems with the Canadian official history because Charles Stacey, in theory, compiled the narratives, but he did not write the final account. That was written by a guy who was a veteran of the Italian campaign, and he was allowed to get on with it and write it. And I think he missed some pretty important points in the process. So, writing history is what historians write, and we rely on the documents. And the documentary record is problematic. With respect to the Balkans, I would anticipate there's quite a bit of stuff. And
I think there is. It just is someone's got to do it. But to bring it back to the topic of discussion, because you've had a leg in each of the kind of the fields I like in terms of the revision of Normandy, because you've had a leg in that kind of working out where that troop of Shermans were in that particular field, approaching that particular battalion. You've that kind of detailed forensic kind of analysis. And we had a show earlier this week with Marcel in Arnhem about the work he's done on the Panzers and the Stugs and things there. And that, but now this book is more angled at the relationships, the dynamics, things like that. Ultimately, what with the D-Day now being 81 years in the past this June, what is there? What do we need to understand? How does reading your book, how does understanding these dynamics help us understand the wider campaign? What's your answer to that?
Well, it's a complex answer. I guess my answer is second front. It's in many ways it's meant to be a direct assault on the old narrative. That I fully believe. I set out to write that book based on the notion that what we understand about Normandy is based on a collision between what the anticipated meaning of the Normandy campaign would be, and the reality on the ground, and then how people reconciled those two things to produce the dominant narrative. And to a very considerable extent, the book does that. But one of the things that has frustrated me no end with the Normandy campaign, almost from the get-go, is so much of it appears to be part of the Anglo-American discourse over who did the heavy lifting, right? Who won the Normandy campaign? Was it the British or was it the Americans? And my answer would be it was the Allies. But in the process, what tends to get ignored is the contribution by a small but actually quite significant Canadian contribution, particularly at the outset on D-Day and dealing with the Panzer threat. There's a Canadian campaign that takes place between the end of Goodwood and Operation Cobra, which has devastating impact on Canada's 2,500 Canadian casualties, basically from one division, in about 3 days under conditions fighting up on that on what we call Verrier Ridge, and you guys are called Ridge, under conditions which resembled Third Ypres. You read George Blackburn's book on the guns of Normandy, and they're up to their thighs in water, firing the guns while the breaches splash in the gun pits, and they're doing that because the Americans aren't ready to go. If you read about Cobra, a lot of the accounts just say, well, what the British and the Canadians do, they're just stuck out in Normandy. It's got nothing to do with what we're doing, man, because Cobra is a made-in-American operation, and it was an American breakthrough, which is just not the case. Klug goes to the Canadian front on the 23rd, I think, of July, and he's there till the 27th of July, because Cobra is not very successful on day one, because of primarily American ammunition shortages. But the Canadians pay dearly for the American delay, which initially is caused by ammunition shortages, not by weather. And then you come down to the Falaise business, and nobody wants to fight at Falaise. Nobody. Bradley's pulled back on I think it's the 13th, 14th from Argentan. That famous, better a solid shouldered Argentan than a broken neck at Falaise. So the Americans won't go. They're headed for Dreux and Chambois and for Paris. When Leclerc is ordered on the 17th of August to attack and capture Trun, 2nd French Armored Division, he flatly refuses to go. No, I'm not going to Trun. My division will be destroyed. So it takes the Americans about 3 days to actually organize a bit of an attack that gets about as far as Chambois. And 2nd French Armored Division actually has 75 tanks idling east of Chambois on 20th of August, within 2 miles of the poles, and they never go. So who's down? My father used to say, and I think I put it in the introduction, if closing the Falaise Gap was so friggin' important, how come the only people down there doing it were us? So you end up with 2nd Canadian Corps at Trun and Saint-Lambert-sur-Dive, which becomes a total nightmare. And the artillery positions northeast of Trun, the guns are actually firing over the top of each other. The 13th Field, my father's regiment, is firing on an arc, I think, of 245 degrees. They've got batteries back to back. And the guns are firing in all directions because 2nd SS Panzer Corps is counterattacking from Vimoutier, trying to get in, while 1st SS Panzer Corps is trying to get out, and the Americans are shelling the area. And the British Army 2nd British Army is spent. 12 corps within artillery range, and they support it with artillery and some patrols from, I think it's 59th Division. But the British Army is if you believe Montgomery, is prepping itself for the drive to the Seine. So, as my father said, if the closing was so important, how come we're the only people there? Well, because apparently it wasn't important. Even Simmons is told, keep 4th Armored ready and one of your infantry divisions ready for the drive to the Seine. Don't commit them down into the Falaise Gap. So Canadians have taken a lot of heat. Chester Wilmot said in the early 1950s, Montgomery could have closed the Falaise Gap if he'd given Simmons a couple of divisions, because the British Army was largely idle. And he's probably right. But at what cost?
I mean, is the Falaise campaign the clearest window we have on the frailties of the Allied relationship? I mean, because June the 6th and the first arguably mostly worked, papered over any cracks or problems, but Falaise, which we must remind ourselves was ultimately a victory. I mean, we did not a complete victory, and exactly how much of a victory is highly debated by historians, not least of which on this channel. But it's not an Allied defeat. It's got to be in the plus column.
Yeah, absolutely. What is you're right in the sense that what happens from about the 19th of August onward is, do we trap the German army? Do we liberate Paris? And do we go to Germany straight?
Yeah.
And Eisenhower decides, for better or for worse, that all the information coming from the Joint Intelligence Committee and from the Swedes and from everybody else is that the Germans will be done by December. We just need to get there and give them a push. And so basically the U.S. Army's gone, with the exception of the long envelopment, which turns into a real disaster. And I talk about the long envelopment in the book. I think it's probably the most comprehensive at the moment. But 250,000 German soldiers, 250,000, escaped from Normandy. And if you believe the American assessment, which was done in 1945, right after the war, and I don't think it was part of the U.S. Strategic Bombing Survey, but basically that same kind of push to find out, the effectiveness of air power. 90% of all the personnel, 94% of all the tanks, and 90% of all the vehicles that get to the Seine River get across. The long envelopment is an absolute. I'm trying to think of a word that I could use that would be acceptable on about.
You can say the F word. I say it all the time.
I can't say clusterfuck because that would.
You can say that. You've said it now. Too late now. Cat's out the bag. Yeah.
And Patton's across the river at Mantes by the 19th of August. Well, the Canadians are still fighting up to their eyeballs in Germans in the Falaise Gap. Patton's actually across the river. He wants to go to Dieppe, and they should have let him go.
I mean, your book is called Second Front, and it's arguably like once you've got the Second Front, that's when the real fighting begins, in that people's ambitions change. Because, that was the theme of our Brittany campaign, and the September is that you just mentioned yourself. The three things Allies have to consider is: are they trying to liberate peoples? Are they trying to gain ground? Or are they trying to annihilate the German army and forces? Because although there's the overlap between those three things, they're not quite the same, are they? And Falaise, I suppose, opens up that idea of, okay, what is our priority now? Just to get miles under our belts and steam towards Germany, or is it to destroy as we go along? And I don't think the Allies really have got that. It's almost the Ardennes campaign that decides where the Allies go next. After that, is that sort of?
There are lots of options available, and everybody in August there is a victory fever is not quite the right word, but it looks like everything is possible.
Yeah,
it looks like it's possible to destroy the German army. We're going to get that done. We're going to liberate Paris, and we're going to keep moving. And if the Joint Intelligence Commission is right, Germany will capitulate by December and the war will be over. And it doesn't happen. And one of the reasons why it doesn't happen is the American logistics failure, which has been in the literature for a long time. And it doesn't happen in part because those 250,000 Germans who escape and all that equipment manages to get itself sorted out with a big inrush of reinforcements from home and solidify the front just at the point where the Allies are culminating logistically. Right. So, I can understand perfectly well. In fact, if you think about historians, the way the documents work, if you're Montgomery, if you're Bradley, if you're Dempsey, if you're Brooke, if you're Marshall, by the time you get to about the 15th of August, you're already thinking about the next operational, if not strategic objective. So the literature, the surviving documents does this flip, and off they go. But the fighting on the ground is not fully resolved until, geez, the 25th of August. And it's estimated that Montgomery tells Brooke on the 19th of August, the Falaise Gap is closed. It's not an issue anymore. We're moving on. Well, at that point, there's still possibly 70,000 German soldiers inside the gap, including 2 army headquarters, 4 corps headquarters, and about 8 or 9 division headquarters, plus their combat echelons. And it's the Canadians. Thank God they were trying to get out, not trying to actually take Currie out, because there's a guy, one of the guys in the South Alberta Regiment, on the 20th of August said it was just trying to stand in front of a buffalo stampede. They weren't trying to find Currie and take him out. They're just trying to get around him. So the night was filled with muzzle flashes and tanks going. And fortunately, no Panzerfausts into the Sherman tanks of the South Alberta Regiment sitting on top of Point 117, because they really didn't care about those guys. They just wanted to get the hell out. And that fighting around Currie's position and the Polish monument goes on till noon on the 21st. There's a huge amount of fighting that goes on.
I love that point where the artillery was, Wotherspoon, and I love standing there. But we could invite you back for that. But I want to end with one kind of question stroke comment, is that clearly your years of teaching as well as writing is that you want to spark debate. You don't want a nod along book, because what's the point? When you finish a lecture, you don't want everyone just go, yep, fine. You want those, but sir, but Mark, but Mr. Miller, because that's how we learn these opinions. So the sidebar has been interesting. The same people have gone, oh, that's perfectly right, and then they've kind of disagreed about certain things, and that's clearly what you want with this book. You want people to be nodding 1 second, they're going, but that can't be right, and then because I think I will, when I get into it properly, I feel I'll be going, oh, hang on, because that's what you want, isn't it?
Well, my objective was to stir the pot. There's no question.
Yeah. You've come in there.
And I was always trained as a young historian that history is an iterative process. So this is my current best guess. I've been working on this for 25 years. I don't expect everybody to like it. Absolutely not. And I'm kind of desperately afraid if I end up in the States, I'll end in Gitmo, right? Because it's pretty hard at different stages on the Americans, because the Americans, we come back to this, don't look particularly critically at their own problems. No. I only got a couple of minutes, but the Brits have a mature system for developing strategy, and it reached its point with the Imperial Defense College in the 20s and 30s, where they could actually think through strategic problems that involve politics and international relations and all of that stuff. And the Americans have 2 stovepipe staff colleges, one for the Navy, one for the Army. They have no way to create a national strategy, let alone an international strategy. And much of the Second World War is the Americans discovering that their systems of command and control and coordination and development of strategy are just immature. And they don't get to those things till after the war. The Brits already understand how the system works. And it's not just 400 years of imperial power. It's actually the impact of the Great War. It's the realization that the war is a continuation of politics by other means. And we got to get the political picture sorted out. We have to get the Italians to surrender with their army intact. And they don't do that. Anyway.
Well, we will leave it on that, and I will leave the audience wanting more, because this conversation, we knew it could have gone on for ages, but we will end it there and invite you back for part 2 perhaps in the future. But it's an outstanding a presentation of facts and things to ponder on, and that's the kind of show I love on this channel more than anything else. When I go to bed going, well, one of the things you'll be saying will be just going round and round in my head, and that's good. I like that. I don't want to nod along chat. So Mark, good luck with the book. Not that you'll need my endorsement.
Hold it up so I can see it again.
Yeah, there we are, second front, Marc Milner there.
Thank you.
So brilliant stuff, folks. I'm back again tomorrow with Steve talking about the 1st Division battling towards the Ruhr and the Rhine. And in the meantime, click like and subscribe and buy my guest books. Cheers, everybody. Have a good day. Bye.
Thanks, Paul.